You've heard of Churchill. You've heard of Hitler. You've heard of trenches, tanks, treaties, and the storming of Normandy. But have you ever heard about the barefoot African boy who marched through the jungles of Burma with a rifle twice his size? Or the Kenyan porter who carried an actual cannon, yes, a real cannon, up the slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro, just because his British commander pointed and said, "Take it there"? Probably not. And you're not alone. For far too long, the history of the world wars has been told as if the rest of the world didn't exist, as if the Allies were just Britain, France, and America holding hands in a freezing trench somewhere in Belgium. But what if I told you that behind many of those Allied victories were millions, yes, millions of African soldiers, laborers, and porters, many of whom didn't even know where Europe was, let alone why its people were so angry with each other? Today, we're pulling back the curtain on one of the most overlooked and underappreciated chapters in global history. This isn't just about war. This is about memory, power, injustice, and the people history tried to forget. Over the course of both world wars, more than 4 million Africans were enlisted, conscripted, or voluntold to fight under European flags. They dug trenches, carried supplies, died in foreign lands, and some even ended up liberating the very nations that colonized them. That's not just irony, that's history with its shoelaces tied together. So why don't we hear about them? Why aren't there stories in the school textbooks, on the war memorials, or in the documentaries we binge at 2 a.m. with snacks? The answer is uncomfortable, because empire doesn't like to share the spotlight with its colonies. It prefers to tell stories where it is the hero and the helper, not the oppressor, not the user, and certainly not the loser. But here's the truth. The role African soldiers played in the world wars was not only crucial, it was foundational. Foundational to how the wars were won, and even more importantly, foundational to how the modern African independence movements began. These wars, brutal as they were, awakened something in Africa, a realization, a rage, a resolve. These men went to fight a white man's war, but they came back ready to fight for their own freedom. In this video, we're going to walk through the trenches, the forests, the deserts, and the forgotten barracks of this hidden history. You'll meet men who crossed oceans they didn't know existed, men who sang war songs in languages their commanders couldn't understand, men who went to war hoping for boots and came back with blisters and bitterness. And yes, there will be moments that make you laugh too, because even in the absurdity of colonial warfare, Africans found ways to crack jokes, dance, and carry goats into battle. You'll see what I mean. So stick with me. You're about to hear stories that history tried to bury beneath medals and myths. By the time we're done, you'll never hear the words World War the same way again. This is the war they never started, but still fought. So how exactly did Africa end up fighting in Europe's wars? The short answer, it was never Africa's choice. The long answer is a messy combination of empire, greed, and a lot of European arrogance wrapped in shiny uniforms and polished boots.
Let's rewind to the late 1800s. European powers, in all their colonial enthusiasm, decided to carve Africa up like a Sunday roast. The infamous Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 saw men with maps and mustaches draw straight lines across entire cultures, tribes, and kingdoms. Britain took some, France took a lot, Germany and Belgium squeezed in, and Italy tried its luck. By the dawn of the 20th century, nearly every inch of Africa was under European control, except Ethiopia and Liberia. To the Europeans, Africa wasn't a continent full of people with history. It was a warehouse of cheap labor and natural resources. And when war broke out in 1914, that warehouse was raided. When World War I began, the colonial powers didn't hesitate. They turned to their colonies and said, "We need men now." But they didn't ask politely. No country held a referendum. No chief got to vote. The call to arms came with the force of colonial law and a bayonet for persuasion. The British conscripted thousands across East and West Africa. The French turned to their vast holdings in West Africa, recruiting a force known as the Tirailleurs Sénégalais, a name that sounds exclusive to Senegal, but actually included men from all over French West Africa. These men were often marched out of villages with promises of pay, food, or adventure, or simply marched out without any promises at all. And then there were the Askaris, African soldiers recruited by the Germans, especially in East Africa. Trained in strict European military fashion, these men were known for their discipline and fierce fighting. They followed German officers into battle against Allied forces, sometimes in places they couldn't pronounce, for reasons they didn't understand. Of course, not everyone carried a rifle. The British came up with something called the Carrier Corps, a tragically underappreciated and overworked force made up of hundreds of thousands of Africans who carried ammunition, food, medicine, and sometimes injured soldiers, often barefoot, often with no pay, and almost always in appalling conditions. Some estimates say more than 1 million African porters were recruited during World War I alone. They didn't fight, but they died in droves from exhaustion, malnutrition, disease, and sheer neglect.
Now, technically, many of these soldiers were volunteers, but we use that word loosely, very loosely. One Ugandan elder joked that colonial volunteering meant a British officer pointing at your family's banana garden and saying, "Nice farm you've got there. Shame if anything happened to it." Imagine being told that if your uncle doesn't sign up, your harvest might mysteriously go missing. It wasn't recruitment, it was extortion with paperwork. A Senegalese elder once laughed while telling his grandchildren, "They told me I was a soldier. I asked, 'What's a soldier?' They said, 'You'll find out when the ship leaves.'" That sums up the experience for many African recruits. No training, no clarity, no idea where they were going. Some thought they were going to war in heaven. Others assumed they were being sold to ghosts. And yet, they went. What's truly wild is that while Europe called it a world war, many of these African men had never even left their region before. Some didn't even know what Europe was. Their first train ride was straight to a military base. Their first ship ride was to a battlefield. Their first gun was handed to them without explanation. And in some cases, they were told not to use it, just carry it, because apparently black soldiers with bullets made their officers nervous. And here lies the supreme irony. These men were dying in wars that had nothing to do with them. Wars fought over European pride, alliances, borders, and the assassination of some archduke in a place they couldn't find on a map. But because they were subjects of empire, they were dragged in, whether they liked it or not. One Congolese porter years later said in disbelief, "We were in the jungle, carrying food from men we couldn't talk to, fighting people we'd never met, under a flag we'd never seen." It wasn't just war, it was confusion at gunpoint. But here's what no one expected. These wars would change the men who fought them. When you send people halfway around the world, when you break their backs and spill their blood for a cause that isn't theirs, you wake something up. You plant questions, you stir up resentment, and you lay the foundation for a storm that's still coming. If war is hell, then Africa's experience during World War I was hell without even the courtesy of firepower. Most people don't know this, but some of the bloodiest, most brutal, and most forgotten battles of the First World War didn't happen in Europe. They happened under the blazing African sun, in swamps filled with malaria, and on mountains that swallowed men whole. And while European soldiers had boots, barracks, and medals, most African troops had none of those, just bare feet, mosquito bites, and a vague hope they might live to see their families again. The East African campaign is perhaps the most chaotic chapter in this mess. Imagine this. The Germans, led by the legendary Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, decide to wage guerrilla warfare across German East Africa, modern-day Tanzania, against British forces.
And the British? They respond by dragging in soldiers, porters, and carriers from across Uganda, Kenya, Malawi, Nigeria, and beyond. Both sides used African soldiers like chess pieces, except the board was the jungle, and the rules changed every morning. On paper, the Germans and British were fighting for control of colonies. In practice, they were making tens of thousands of Africans walk, carry, dig, and die for reasons the average soldier couldn't explain without getting confused halfway through. For the Europeans, it was about empire and pride. For the Africans, it was about survival, or sometimes just about obeying the man with the whip. At the center of this was the Carrier Corps, the most tragically under-acknowledged group of the war. These weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. They didn't fire weapons. Most weren't even given uniforms. Many didn't even know what side they were on. Their job? To carry the war, literally. Over 1 million African porters were conscripted, many by force, to haul food, ammunition, tents, cannons, medicine, and sometimes the wounded. If a European soldier needed it, an African back carried it. They moved through treacherous terrain, through the swamps of the Rufiji River, the ridges of the Usambara Mountains, and the mosquito-infested valleys that chewed through entire units with disease. Malaria, dysentery, exhaustion. These were the real killers of the East African Front, and the Carrier Corps were always on the front lines of that suffering. Some carriers died with no one even bothering to write down their names. They were buried in shallow graves or left where they fell. And yet, the war machinery rolled on, because that's what empire does. It forgets those who carry its weight the moment they collapse.
A surviving Kenyan carrier once said, "We carried guns we weren't allowed to touch. We fed men who called us monkeys, and when the war ended, they told us to go home and pretend nothing happened." That quote might just summarize the African experience of World War I. And still, through all that, a strange kind of camaraderie formed. The shared suffering brought men from different tribes and regions together. A man from Uganda learned songs from a Luo comrade, a Swahili speaker learned bits of Yoruba. In the worst conditions imaginable, they found bits of humanity. They joked. They teased each other. One carrier, half laughing and half tired, reportedly bragged to his children years later, "One day, I outran a lion and a German. The lion was easier." Even in the belly of hardship, Africans found laughter, a kind of sacred rebellion. Let's talk numbers. The British recruited roughly 100,000 soldiers and over 600,000 porters from their East African colonies alone. And that doesn't even count those from West Africa or other parts of the continent. Many of these men were ill-fed, poorly clothed, and entirely unpaid. Others were promised small wages, but when the war ended, those promises evaporated like morning mist. The porters who survived returned home with broken bodies, psychological scars, and stories no one believed or wanted to hear. And while the Europeans erected monuments to their own heroes, Africa got silence. No medals, no statues, just ghost stories told around fires. Ghosts of friends who never came back,
Ghosts of battles where no one knew what victory looked like. What's worse, even those who managed to survive and return home received little to no support. No pensions, no counseling, no compensation. For many, their reward for 4 years of hell was a tattered certificate or a dismissive salute. Others didn't even get that. In colonial records, many were listed not as warriors, but as native laborers. Let that sink in. Not warriors, not heroes, laborers. As if carrying a 90-pound artillery shell through the jungle while dodging bullets was just another day at the office. This betrayal, this erasure, was not accidental. It was systematic. The colonial powers wanted African manpower, not African memory. They needed the bodies, but feared what might happen if those same bodies remembered how the empire treated them. And so, history was rewritten, whitewashed, sanitized, and the names of Africa's soldiers were left to rot in unmarked graves. But memory, as it turns out, is harder to kill than a man. These stories survived, in hushed voices, in family legends, in dusty journals found in old trunks. They survived through grandfathers who told their sons, "I went to war for a country that didn't know my name," and through grandsons who now say, "Then we'll tell the world who you were." World War I may have ended in 1918, but for many Africans, the war continued long after, in aching backs, in untreated wounds, in empty pockets, and in the bitter realization that the empire they bled for was never going to thank them. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The gunfire, the marching, the malaria, the German accents barking across African hills. After all the sweat, suffering, and spilled blood, World War I ended not with fanfare for African fighters, but with silence. Deafening silence. The men who survived the jungle campaigns limped home to their villages. Some were missing limbs, others came back with memories that refused to stay buried, and many returned to find that nothing had changed. The chiefs still answered to colonial administrators, the taxes were still high, and their sacrifices apparently invisible. No medals, no parades, not even a simple thank you. One Ugandan ex-carrier reportedly asked, "Can I exchange my malaria for land?" The officer laughed. He didn't.
For most African veterans, their compensation was the privilege of going back to the same poverty they had left behind, only now with nightmares and a deep ache in their bones. Promises had been made in the fever of war, promises of freedom, of land, of citizenship, of dignity. But as the dust of battle settled, so too did those promises, right into the footnotes of forgotten memos. In Senegal, a man named Mamadou returned from the Western Front after serving in the Tirailleurs Sénégalais. He thought perhaps the French government would help him start a farm. Instead, he found himself back under the same colonial rule that had drafted him in the first place. When he asked for assistance, an official told him, "France is tired. Be grateful you came back with both eyes." Charming. And yet, something had shifted. Even if the empire didn't notice it, the veterans did. For the first time, they had seen the world beyond their villages. They had traveled by ship. They had walked across countries. They had seen white men cry, white men beg, white men die. The myth of European invincibility cracked somewhere in the mud of the trenches. And though these returning soldiers weren't organizing revolutions just yet, they were asking questions. Why do we serve a flag we don't understand? Why is my skin good enough to die in Europe, but not good enough to own land at home? Why did my brother vanish in a war he didn't start, and no one ever said his name again? A Nigerian veteran once told a young boy, "We fought like lions, we came home like flies." And yet those flies began to buzz louder. The seed had been planted, deep in the soil of betrayal and watered by disillusionment. And in time, those seeds would bloom into something empires feared more than German bullets: African resistance. But before that could happen, the world would fall apart again. Just when Africa had started to breathe again, the drums of war rolled in like a storm cloud over a tired village. Less than 2 decades after the First Great War, Europe lit the world on fire once more, and again, Africa was told to grab a bucket. This time, it wasn't just about trenches and bayonets. World War II sprawled like an overgrown vine. North Africa, Burma, Italy, Madagascar. The war had grown teeth, and the empires needed bodies. A new generation of Africans found themselves swept up in the chaos. Some were conscripted at gunpoint. Others signed up willingly. But when your stomach is empty and a recruiter waves promises of pay, land, or even 3 square meals, willing becomes a relative term. From Nigeria to Ghana, Kenya to Uganda, Malawi to Zambia, the enlistment numbers swelled. In Uganda, the King's African Rifles expanded with boys barely old enough to shave. A 19-year-old named Kato was sent to fight in Burma. Before leaving, he wrapped mango seeds in cloth and handed them to a fellow recruit. He said, "Plant these in my village. Even if I don't return, let my mangoes grow." The journey was brutal. African soldiers were shipped across oceans, placed in environments they didn't understand, often with equipment older than their fathers. The racial hierarchy remained firmly in place. White officers got boots. African soldiers got canvas shoes. If the boots tore, they were replaced. If a foot tore, well, the man limped.
There were countless moments of absurdity. One Ugandan soldier remembers receiving his first British Army biscuit. Dry as sawdust, it crumbled in his hands. He looked up at the officer and asked, "Where's the tea?" The officer replied, deadpan, "Go fight the Japanese and come back for it." Classic colonial hospitality. But despite it all, the African soldiers held their ground and more. In Burma, East African troops became legends. In North Africa, Nigerian regiments braved desert heat that melted gunmetal. In Madagascar, African divisions pushed back Vichy French forces. These weren't just sidekicks in someone else's war. They were the backbone of entire campaigns. And yet, while the war raged on foreign soil, African families waited with prayer and silence. Letters came sporadically, sometimes sweet, often haunting. One Ghanaian mother received a note from her son, "Tell my brother to marry Amina. If I do not return, she must still laugh in this life." He never did return. There were no welcome home parades for the African veterans. No monuments, no flags at half-mast. Just rows of names in British ledgers and unmarked graves in Burmese jungles. Some were buried under fake names because the officers couldn't pronounce the real ones. For those who survived, life resumed, but not really. Many came back poorer than when they left. The promises? Delayed? Denied? Or just disappeared? One Kenyan ex-soldier asked for his army pension. The clerk replied, "Pension? We already gave you your boots." The man had come back barefoot. Still, in small ways, the war left a mark. In a village in central Uganda, the mango tree from Kato seeds began to bear fruit, years after the man who planted them had vanished into the mist of Burma. His mother never stopped sitting beneath it. World War II cost the lives of over 100,000 African soldiers and porters, but their names rarely make the history books. No Churchill quote, no documentaries, no epic war films starring men who looked like them. And yet, without their courage, without their willingness to bleed on battlefields they couldn't even spell, the outcome of the war might have looked very different. Once again, Africa answered when empire called. But the question was beginning to echo louder. Who will answer for Africa? If you're still watching, thank you. Seriously. You're now part of the small tribe that refuses to let these stories disappear into silence. So here's a little request. Hit that subscribe button, like this video, and share it with someone who still thinks history only happened in Europe. Because here's the truth. When Europe bled, Africa bled too. When bombs fell in Berlin, sons from Kisumu, Kumasi, and Kampala were on the front lines. And when the dust settled, their names were left out of the story. But not here. On this channel, we remember, we honor, we speak their names out loud. All right, deep breath, back to the story. When World War II ended, the African continent was not the same. Neither were the men who returned to it. Across British and French colonies, thousands of African soldiers who had fought, bled, and died for European powers came home with their eyes wide open. They had marched through European cities, seen bombs tear apart what were once called great civilizations, and watched white men cry, starve, and beg. The illusion was broken. For decades, colonizers had built their power on the idea of superiority, moral, intellectual, and military. But war had exposed the truth.
As one Ghanaian veteran would later say, they are not gods, they are just white men. These returning veterans had fought alongside Europeans as comrades. They had manned the trenches, held the line, and survived the blood-soaked fields of Italy, Burma, and North Africa. And in doing so, they realized something life-altering. The colonial powers were not invincible. The myth of white invulnerability had collapsed under the weight of artillery fire. These soldiers had stared death in the face, shoulder to shoulder with men they had once been taught were superior, and survived. And they didn't come back home to be treated like subjects. They came back expecting respect. But that's not what they received. Instead of parades, pensions, or promises fulfilled, many veterans were greeted with silence, suspicion, and systematic mistreatment. Their sacrifices were minimized. Their salaries were withheld. In French colonies especially, the betrayal cut deep. One of the darkest moments came in December 1944 in a small military camp near Dakar, Senegal. It's a story that still burns in the memory of many Africans, the Tirailleurs massacre. Hundreds of Senegalese tirailleurs, African soldiers who had served France with loyalty, gathered at the Tirailleurs camp. They were not there to riot. They weren't even armed. They had returned from fighting Nazi Germany and were simply demanding the back pay and benefits they were promised. But instead of dialogue, they were met with bullets. French troops opened fire on their own veterans, unarmed black men who had worn their uniform with pride. Dozens were killed. Some say the number was higher. Paris tried to cover it up, but the damage had already been done. The massacre sent a shockwave through the continent. If even loyal African soldiers, men who had risked their lives for the tricolor flag, could be gunned down for asking what was rightfully theirs, then what hope was there for the rest of the population? The betrayal felt by these veterans turned into something powerful, a burning, righteous anger, and that anger began to spread. Why, they asked, should we fight for freedom in Europe only to accept chains at home? From the dust of war, a new generation of African revolutionaries was rising, trained not in universities, but in trenches. Veteran-led movements began to take shape. In Nigeria, ex-servicemen formed unions and began organizing protests. In Kenya, many former soldiers joined the Mau Mau resistance. In French West Africa, veterans helped fuel independence campaigns and nationalist movements.
These weren't just angry young men. They were disciplined, organized, and deeply disillusioned by the empire they once defended.
They had seen what Europe didn't want Africa to see, that the empire bled, that it broke, and that it could fall. Colonial masters were rattled. The pre-war system of control, built on fear, myth, and forced ignorance, was no longer working. African veterans were now politically aware. Many had been exposed to democratic ideals while abroad. They had heard conversations about human rights and freedom, words that rang hollow when applied only to white citizens. And they began to demand those same rights for themselves, their families, and their nations. World War II, ironically, became the catalyst for the undoing of the very empires it was fought to preserve. It sowed the seeds of revolution not just through ideology, but through experience. African soldiers had lived through Europe's darkest hour. They had watched empires cling to survival. And when they returned home, they realized if Europe could be brought to its knees, then so could colonialism. These were no longer peasants and laborers blindly obeying the crown or the republic. These were men who had worn uniforms, held rank, commanded troops, and returned with a vision of an Africa that was no longer subservient. The war had not just opened their eyes, it had lit a fire. And that fire would soon become a blaze, spreading from Accra to Algiers, from Kampala to Casablanca. The guns of World War II may have gone silent, but the fight for Africa's future had only just begun. The men who once wore boots for empire now carried banners for freedom. After the war, African veterans, betrayed by the colonial powers they had defended, became the very spark that would ignite the fight for independence across the continent. Trained, disciplined, and politically awakened by the experience of global warfare, these ex-servicemen were not content to fade quietly into colonial shadows. They had seen too much, sacrificed too much, lost too much, and they refused to accept that the world they returned to should remain unchanged. In Ghana, then still known as the Gold Coast, one man saw an opportunity in this restless generation. His name, Kwame Nkrumah. A visionary nationalist with a magnetic presence and a deep understanding of Pan-African ideals, Nkrumah recognized that the war had created a new kind of African, a soldier who had fought for democracy abroad and now wanted it at home. He began to organize these veterans, drawing them into the Convention People's Party and igniting a grassroots movement that would shake British rule to its core. These ex-servicemen, many still wearing pieces of their old uniforms, took to the streets not as rebels, but as patriots, demanding the freedom they had earned with blood and bravery.
It wasn't just Ghana. Across the continent, veterans became the backbone of nationalist movements. In Kenya, the Mau Mau Uprising, one of the most intense and brutal anti-colonial rebellions in British Africa, was fueled, in part, by disillusioned ex-soldiers. Many of them had fought in Burma and North Africa, only to return and find their land stolen, their voices silenced, and their dignity trampled. They buried their medals, picked up machetes and rifles, and took to the forests. What had once been a war for empire was now a war against it. In Nigeria, too, the winds of change were blowing. The return of thousands of veterans brought a new political energy to the colonies. The colonial government had expected gratitude, What they got was outrage. These men had served under the Union Jack, believing in the idea of the British Empire as a force for civilization. But after facing racism within the ranks and injustice at home, they began to see the empire for what it truly was, a system built on exploitation. They became some of the loudest voices in Nigeria's growing nationalist movement, supporting leaders like Nnamdi Azikiwe and Tafawa Balewa as they pushed for self-governance and national pride. The experience of war also did something profound. It fostered a Pan-African consciousness. African soldiers from different tribes, regions, and even colonial powers had fought side by side. In the trenches, they had bled together. In the camps, they had shared food, stories, and pain. That shared suffering planted a seed. Suddenly, the idea of nation expanded. A Kenyan soldier could understand the frustration of a Nigerian one. A Ghanaian veteran could see himself in the anger of an Algerian rebel. The struggle for freedom was no longer just local, it was continental. One unnamed veteran put it simply but powerfully. The German had a gun, the British had a crown, but we had something stronger: anger and memory. That memory of betrayal, of sacrifice, of war was not easily forgotten. It hardened into conviction, and conviction turned into movement. Across Africa, post-war conferences began calling for independence. Educated elites joined forces with veterans. Churches, trade unions, and students began mobilizing. Everywhere, colonial governments found themselves facing a population that no longer feared them. The world had changed, and Africa was changing with it. Ironically, World War II had created freedom fighters without intending to. The colonial powers had armed Africans to fight their enemies, but in doing so, they also trained them to organize, to lead, and to resist.
What began as an imperial military machine ended up forging the very men who would dismantle that empire from within. And as the 1950s dawned, the tremors became earthquakes. One by one, colonial governments were forced to negotiate, to retreat, to relinquish control. It wasn't just the weight of international pressure or changing global politics. It was the boots on the ground, the banners in the streets, the voices shouting from Accra to Addis Ababa that Africa would no longer be ruled by outsiders. The veterans had returned, not to rest, but to rise. War is hell, but even hell had jokes. Between the gunfire, the dust, the hunger, and the heartbreak, African soldiers found ways to laugh. Not because war was funny, but because sometimes laughter was all that stood between sanity and despair. And amid the cruelty of World War II, the absurd had a way of sneaking in and saving souls. Take, for example, the story of Corporal Goat. In a remote Allied camp somewhere in North Africa, an African soldier from Uganda brought with him a goat, not for food, not for milk, but for luck. He swore the goat had followed him from home and refused to be left behind. Against all odds, the animal survived multiple battles, air raids, and one failed British rationing policy. The unit became so attached to it that the commanding officer, in a strange mix of exhaustion and affection, formally promoted the goat to corporal. The title stuck. The men would salute it, feed it first, and claim it had better instincts than any lieutenant. Corporal Goat, they joked, never lost a man.
Then there were the singing camels. In the deserts of Libya, where the sand could fry your boots and the thirst could crack your lips, camels were sometimes the only option for transport. But these weren't your obedient, desert-hardened beasts of burden. No, these were divas with humps. Soldiers quickly discovered that the camels would refuse to move unless they were sung to. So every morning, a bizarre symphony would rise from the dunes. Swahili lullabies, Lagunda chants, and rhythmic grunts all sung in unison to get the caravan going. If you were quiet enough, you could hear it. War songs not for men, but for camels with attitude. And then there's the time a young drummer from Tanzania, known only as Mwita, ended up teaching his British officer how to dance Gwara Gwara right there in the middle of a tense moment on the Libyan front. Mwita had been pounding on a ration box to keep spirits up, and when the rhythm caught on, he broke into the dance. The officer, confused but curious, asked for a lesson. That afternoon, in the middle of no man's land, bullets occasionally flying overhead, the two danced, one stiff as a fence post, the other flowing like a drum beat. The entire unit watched in disbelief, then joined in. It was madness. It was magic. Laughter didn't always come from music or mischief. Sometimes it came from banana peels. Deployed in East African units, far from proper supplies, some African soldiers began brewing a hot drink made from dried banana peels. They jokingly called it British medicine. Why? Because it didn't cure anything, but it made you feel slightly less dead inside. The concoction was bitter, barely drinkable, but sipping it around a fire turned into ritual. With each steaming cup, stories were swapped, memories shared, and courage quietly restored. These moments of absurdity were not distractions. They were tools of survival. Where there was no reason to smile, African soldiers made one. Where death lingered, they invited joy, even if it came dressed as a dancing British officer or a stubborn camel. These were not just jokes. They were acts of resistance, of humanity. A way of saying, you may have sent us to war, but you will not take our spirit.
As one veteran later put it, the war tried to turn us into machines, but we told stories, sang songs, played tricks, and even laughed at death. That's how we stayed human. In the middle of gunfire and grief, a goat got promoted. A camel demanded a serenade, and a drummer turned a battlefield into a dance floor. Sometimes, the best way to fight madness is to laugh right in its face. History is not just what happened. It's what's remembered, what's written down, what gets carved in stone, and what gets erased. Walk through the war memorials in London, Paris, or Brussels, and you'll see rows upon rows of names. Smiths, Dubois, Janssens. Brave men, no doubt. Honored heroes. But you'll search long and hard for a Wambua, a Makori, or a Nkube. African soldiers fought. African soldiers bled. African soldiers died. But history gave them barely a footnote. In European textbooks, Winston Churchill gets entire chapters. His speeches, his cigars, his strategy. Meanwhile, African heroes like Leopold Sédar Senghor, who served in the French army and later led Senegal into independence, are given a sentence, maybe two. Senghor was captured and held in a Nazi camp. He came home not just with wounds, but with words. Words that would become poetry, politics, and protest. Yet, He remains a paragraph in the great epic of European remembrance. What about the men from Nigeria who marched under the scorching sun for the British Empire? Or the Kenyans who were promised land and dignity only to return to colonial chains? What about the Ugandan soldiers who faced tanks with nothing but rifles and rage? Where are their stories? Where are their statues? Where are their graves? Many were never returned to their homelands. Their bones rest in unmarked fields. Some were hastily buried, others simply forgotten.
No medals, no parades, no pension. For decades, even their names were missing from roll calls of remembrance. As one bitter veteran once said, we were buried in the footnotes of history. But the silence is breaking. Today, across Africa and beyond, there's a growing movement to reclaim memory, to ask the hard questions. Who tells the story? Who decides who matters? In cities across the continent, memorial campaigns are rising. In Accra, Dar es Salaam, Nairobi, voices are calling from monuments that honor Africa's forgotten fighters, not as side characters in someone else's tale, but as central heroes in a shared human struggle. Young historians are digging deep, literally and figuratively, to unearth oral histories passed down through families. Grandchildren are sitting with aging veterans, recording their stories, preserving their photos, archiving their medals. These aren't just family mementos, they are pieces of a stolen narrative. Across universities in Africa, historians are finally writing our version of the war, no longer filtered through colonial eyes, no longer edited for comfort. These scholars are naming names, mapping burial sites, and publishing truths that have long been swept under the imperial rug. And the voices are growing louder.
In global forums, calls for recognition and reparations are being raised, not out of bitterness, but out of justice. The world can't pretend it was only Europe that bore the weight of World War II. Africa carried the burden too, in blood, in labor, in silence. One historian said it best: to forget them is to fight the war all over again. To forget is to let injustice win. To pretend those lives didn't count is to rewrite the war with a lie. So now we ask, who tells your story? Because if we don't, someone else will, and they'll tell it wrong. They'll leave out the goat who became a corporal. They'll skip the tea made from banana peels. They'll silence the pain and strip away the pride. We must become the storytellers, the archivists, the griots. We must honor not just the victories, but the voices. As we stand today, decades after the last gun was fired, the real war continues, not with bullets, but with memory. And this time, we fight not to take land, but to reclaim legacy, because their story is our story. And until it is told truthfully, the war is not truly over. History often forgets the builders of bridges they never got to walk across. African soldiers, young, scared, determined, were thrown into the global fires of World War II. Many didn't even know what they were fighting for, but they fought anyway. They crossed oceans, climbed mountains, crawled through trenches, and faced the fury of empire and enemy alike. They fought under foreign flags, took commands in languages they barely spoke, marched through snow and desert alike, and somehow they kept going. They fought for freedom, even when it wasn't theirs yet. And in doing so, they shaped a future they couldn't yet see. Without their service, without their courage, the winds of independence that swept across Africa in the decades after the war might never have come. Their sacrifices lit a match in the hearts of nations still under colonial rule. They showed that Africans were not inferior, not incapable, not irrelevant.
They were brave, skilled, unbreakable. And word got out. The war had changed the world, but it had also changed Africa. Men came back home, not as boys, but as warriors. Women who served, whether in support roles or as hidden resistance, came back with stories, with strength. They began to ask, if I could fight for the empire, why can't I fight for my own freedom? The chain reaction was unstoppable. The decolonization movement was ignited by those who had once been told they had no voice. Countries began to rise. Flags began to change. Borders were redrawn. The empire trembled. And it all traced back, in part, to the generation that had gone to war and come back different. They may not have known it at the time, but these African soldiers were building the very foundation of the Africa we stand on today. It's time we honored that. Their courage, their sacrifice, their resilience should be remembered in every African classroom. Their stories should be told in every textbook, documentary, and Independence Day parade, not as side characters in someone else's narrative, but as the authors of their own legacy. Let me make this personal. I never met my grandfather, but I was told he marched through sandstorms so I could walk free in a schoolyard. He carried a rifle through someone else's war so I could carry books through corridors of my own making. He never saw a black president, never cast a vote, never owned land. But I do, because of him, because of all of them.
And so the question now turns to you. Will you carry the story forward? Will you ask your elders what they remember? Will you preserve the fading photos and handwritten letters? Will you record those voices before they're lost? Because remembering them is an act of justice. Sharing their story is an act of defiance. Honoring their sacrifice is an act of hope. So share this, talk about it, teach it. Let your children know that Africa didn't just survive history, it shaped it. This is your story too. And as we close, I want to return to the promise we made at the very beginning of this journey. There's a part of history that was taken from us. It's time to take it back. Now you know. Don't forget. History belongs to those who tell it. And for too long, Africa's soldiers have been the silent ghosts in someone else's war stories. Their courage, pain, laughter, and legacy have echoed quietly in footnotes, unseen, unheard, unhonored. But now you know. Let this be your invitation, not just to remember, but to retell, to honor, to ask questions, to dig deeper, to preserve the photos, record the voices, visit the graves, and say their names out loud. Share this story with someone. Post about it. Teach your children. Challenge the textbooks. Because if we don't,
we risk forgetting them all over again, and the price of silence is too high. They fought for a freedom they never got to enjoy. Let's give them something better in return: memory, legacy, and truth. The world forgot them once. Let's not do it again.